Well, happy Halloween to the world. I am super excited about today's discussion. There's an underlying current and force that people just don't see. They may wake up, put on their Halloween costume, go trick-or-treating, and then that's it. Then it's November. But in my research today, I've learned some really interesting things. And I thought it would be important to start off with the history of Halloween, to get a little context into why we have this holiday. And it ultimately has origins in the Celtic people. And so this time, holiday, whatever you want to call it, for the Celtic people back then, it marked the summer's end and the onset of winter's darkness. It was celebrated at the same time, similarly around October 31st. And seeing it at this time, you can get a sense of what was on their mind. The summer's over. Summer's great. It's time of heat, water, your crops are growing, but fall is harvest season. And that is also a great time. It can be a great time, but it also can be a devastating time because you're heading into winter. And if your crops fail, you are dead, literally. And so this festival time period acted as a liminal state in between that time. And the Celtic people believed that that's when the spirits were believed to cross over into the living world. And so it had two factors. The first being a spiritual aspect to it, that dead people could come in. And the second aspect being that you were vulnerable in that time right before winter. And so it became a ritualistic period for the Celtic people when they would perform rituals to meet those two ends. First, so that they could please the gods and hopefully have a great harvest, while also protecting themselves from evil spirits. And so this was how it started out. And this survived for thousands of years. Obviously, during that time, there were other versions of this. There were a Roman layering. This would be a few hundred years later, where they honored the dead through ritual offering. And they had what was called Pomona, which celebrated the goodness or celebrated the goddess of fruit and harvest. And I bring in the Roman aspect of this because it kind of explains the two approaches, because they're in similar time periods. People are dealing with the same issues of survival and spirituality, but they have two different approaches. The one is, okay, the Romans are going to honor the dead, and they're going to celebrate the goddess that brings them a good harvest. Their approach is more hopeful. It's more elevating. It's aspiring to reach their goals. In the contrast with the Celtics, they're afraid. They're acting out of fear. So their rituals are protecting themselves from the dead instead of honoring them and giving offerings to appease the gods. So I just think that's interesting that they had two different approaches. But going past this, we have the Christian theological views that kind of intersect. At this time period in, I'd say about the 8th century, Christianity spread, right? And pagan rituals started to leave, but they weren't expelled. They were rather integrated into the new church culture and practices and so the church established All Saints Day, which was November 1st, All Hallows Day, and then he made a Hallows Eve, which at the time wasn't necessarily denoting anything that we believe to be Halloween today or that we see. It was simply the day before Saints Day, like Christmas Eve. But with these Samhain customs from the Celtics, from the Romans, they all got molded together. The pagan traditions with the Christian theology molded together. And this happened in a few variety of ways that I'll go into a little bit more detail later. But you can see how beliefs got reinterpreted as they molded together. And so an example would be fairies. To the Celtics, they were one thing, but to the Christians, they were believed as fallen angels. And so that's an example of how those molded together. And fast forward a few hundred years more, we get into the 8th. And this began as Irish and Scottish immigrants brought Halloween to America. And this transitioned more from superstition to a more societal acceptable approach to Halloween. And so they'd have parades, games, neighborhood celebration. And the 20th century kind of marks the last big change that Halloween underwent, which fell under the baby boom era. And It's when Halloween was commercialized, large scale, and they reoriented it tailored to the children, bringing out trick-or-treating and costumes, and it became a day of play, fear, and fantasy. And so as I was going through my research, I looked at patterns. I tried to understand, okay, what pattern emerges here? If it is a long time standing holiday, if it's something that transcended culture and religion, that means it's big. Because if it doesn't last, it's not important, relatively speaking. But this lasted for whatever reason. And so I thought, okay, why? And these are the patterns that I came up with. The big overarching pattern I think is very interesting. It may not be completely true, but it's what I've come to find. I think that Halloween throughout all time represents how humans interact with what threatens them. And there are two categories to what threatens humans. The first category being natural evil. That's tragedy, death, things we can't control. The second is moral evil. And that is deliberate evil or deliberate maladaptive acts from humans. Maladaptive being anything that hurts us. And so that is my pattern. That is my theory. And so I'm going to take you through each of the time periods of Halloween and how that applies. So first, we can go back to the Celtics. And I talked about how that time for the Celtics and the Romans was more survival based. It integrated religion, but it was pagan traditions. All beliefs in nature forces that humans suffered from the effects of, but they necessarily couldn't control them. And so in survival, you have the fear of death and you have the uncontrollable harvest in preparation for winter. And so the Celtics, they lit bonfires, they donned costumes, often made of animal skins, to ward off roaming spirits and protect themselves from malevolent forces. Different than the Roman tradition that praised the goddess of harvest and honored the dead. The next example is that of evil. And this gets brought into light with the Christian intersection with Halloween in the 8th century. Christians reoriented it around their worldview, categorizing and adding definition to the obscure. And so you can see this evolutionarily. Once humans' survival needs are met, what do they go to? They go to philosophy, they go to art, they go to spirituality. And Christianity took these obscure things and made judgments. So previously, they put so much weight into forces beyond themselves. But now they're getting smart, they're able to survive, and so they think they're getting smarter. And so they put definitions on everything. The example would be that the church's influence reframed certain pagan elements as evil. Fairies were recast as fallen angels, and practitioners of old nature religions were branded as witches in the demonic sense. And so I have those two. First, it was survival, then it was evil. But then this one is really interesting. Next, Halloween became festivalized. And this is fascinating because it's where modern society diminishes the threat. That's how we approach the things that threaten us. Christians were trying to name them, define them, understand them, and now we're trying to diminish them. I thought of this particularly in light of World War II. Right after World War II, Halloween was reoriented around children, and it made a big push to make costumes and go trick-or-treating and kind of festivalize it. This is interesting because it's not like those people didn't know about evil. That generation didn't have an understanding. In fact, it probably had more of an understanding than any generation since, because it had just undergone 2 world wars, a gigantic genocide. And in that sense, I think it diminishes the threats of death and evil. It lets us mock or subvert evil by caricaturing it. You can think of it as a little kid who's dressed up as the devil, wearing a devil mask. It kind of reduces it by placing it in a plastic red costume with horns. And so overall, whether or not this can be categorized this simplistically into three categories of survival, evil, and festival, I think there are common themes that show up about how humans interact with what threatens them. So all in all, this leads to my next question, which is, what does Halloween today reveal about how we interact with what threatens us? And this is a very fascinating question, because if we can look at people of old time and what they did, and maybe how Halloween showed a little bit about how they interacted with what threatens them, we can do the same thing for us today. And as I looked into this in my research, I found this concept called the hedonic control, and it was named by Katerina Batinaki. Hedonism is a philosophy where it searches for the ultimate good through pleasure. And so this theory, Katerina argues that the pleasure of horror comes from a hedonic calculus of control. Fear and disgust can excite us only when we maintain some agency. The knowledge that we can turn off the movie or walk out of the haunted house at any time turns fear into fun. This is a big answer, or a potential answer, to why we do what we do at Halloween. Why do we enjoy, or is there a big market off of thriller or horror movies? Why do we purposely go into haunted houses? I think it all comes back to this concept that we feel fear, but when it's organized in some element of control, when we know it's fake or we know it's time-bound, then we don't become so afraid of it. It becomes thrilling, and that is what Halloween is. And so we can approach this hedonic control to both aspects of evil, that being natural suffering, tragedy, death, but also moral evil, being the deliberate and maladaptive action that humans take. And this all stems from the pattern that Halloween represents how humans interact with what threatens them. And so to this day, although we have great survival rate and we can control a lot of variables and we have a lot of empirical knowledge about the world, stories of what threatens humanity is death. We can't cheat that. We haven't yet. And evil, our own ability to self-destruct, inevitably. And so these are the two categories that we still face today. And so if you approach suffering, things like death, things like natural disaster, Halloween, we dress up as ghosts or we dress up as vampires. And we go to a haunted house and we watch scary movies of people dying all the time. But instead of fear, we feel thrill. And that is the hedonic pleasure that kind of offsets the fear in our mind. During Halloween, we get to dip our toes into chaos and darkness, then quickly return to safety, which makes the experience exhilarating rather than traumatizing. We know we enjoy the horror because we know it's temporary and escapable. So the thought is that Halloween represents how humans interact with what threatens them. And today we know that what threatens us is still the natural evil of death and tragedy, and the moral evil of self-destruction, potential maladaptive behavior. And so when we think about the psychology of this, we go to the hedonic control that argues that fear, when controlled, becomes thrilling. And that's what makes these games or these movies enjoyable. And the connection that I'm drawing is that moral evil is a whole different category, but comparing it to natural evil helped me understand a parallel that I'd never seen before. And that parallel is that thrill, allurement of hedonic control, rather than feeling fear, we can feel thrilled, and that's pleasurable. That is what is tempting to humans in terms of moral good and evil, because it allows us to flirt with our impulses, flirt with things that are necessarily not good but still pleasurable, because there's a sense of control. Otherwise, we would just feel fear. There wouldn't be any thrill. But when we can control the odds, and when there is some pleasure to be obtained, it becomes tempting. And so based off this theory, I've come up with this question that if the thrill comes from believing we are in control, does fear return when we lose it? And I would argue that yes, it does. Because you can take the simplest example of Halloween. If we go into a haunted house, we can feel thrilled because we know that the environment is controlled. Same thing with people dressing up as ghosts or whatever it may be. But if you take that control out of the equation, then the fear returns because you don't have any control anymore. That would be like entering an actual haunted house, or that would be like being in the horror film. When the world is ending, you're no longer seeing it on the movie screen, it's happening in real life. And so that thrill turns to fear. And so those are the foundational concepts that I feel like are important to understand. But even more important and cool than those concepts are the implications and applications of them. Because if you take it a step further and look at the implications, you realize that there are dual nature effects of playing with darkness based on how we as humans interact with it. There is potential good because of our playful nature of dressing up and kind of diminishing the evil by caricaturizing it, there's a term called emotional catharsis, and that is when symbolic fear allows pent up anxiety to surface and to release. It's like a roller coaster or a fire drill. We get the exhilaration followed by the calm. We get the exhilaration, we get to experience the fear, but without the actual impending negative effects ever happening. And the simplest way to think about it is like a fire alarm. When we have a fire alarm, we get to practice what would happen if that ever actually happened. And that is important and it's helpful because if we practice again and again, then when a fire actually happens, then we'll be prepared for it. And this can be the same in humans because the big tendency with humanity is to not face the evil or not face what threatens us, but either expel it so we don't have to deal with it and avoid it, or we kind of hide it. And that can be for natural or moral evil. But when we do the fire alarms, when we do the test drills, that can help us in a natural evil scenario when tragedy does strike. And the same can be true for moral evil. If we see temptation as something that only needs to be expelled and the darkness should be under a rug, then when it comes, we won't be prepared for it in the same way that a fire would come and we wouldn't be prepared for it if we never practiced the fire alarm drill. And so that is the potential good that can come out of those effects. The potential bad is that we get too comfortable with evil. This goes back to the shadow play idea that I talked about, is that when we think we get too comfortable, we think that we can control it. That's when it goes from tragedy to evil. The thrill becomes temptation. And that is what I was talking about with moral evil. If we spend too much time trying to control the elements, then we think that we have control. And so humans could build dams, or they could try and make earthquake-proof structures. Those are just examples. But if we get too comfortable in that idea that we do have control, when the tragedy strikes, we will obviously still get hurt, but the danger of that is that we won't be prepared. And the same thing happens with moral evil, is that when you play with the darkness, it's as simple as the idea of if you play with fire, you're going to get burned. And so I raise these points. They're important to explain why society has put Halloween in the box that it's in, but it's also important for us to take personal responsibility of how we should approach Halloween. And more than that, just the natural darkness and moral darkness that we face as just humans being alive. But with this adds value, potentially, of what Halloween can do for us in our lives. And this has to do more with the moral side of evil. As I thought about it, I realized that Halloween in this way can play a kind of folk therapy. Based on the psychologist Carl Jung, he talked about the shadow side. And he researched a lot about change and alchemy. And alchemy is the process that a human undergoes during change. And the first step in that process is called nigredo, or darkening. And that's the Latin term for it. And what he terms as the shadow, that idea plays a role in that first darkening stage. The shadow is the darker side of ourselves that we deny. We have our persona of what we put our best foot forward. The shadow would be everything that's not included in that. It would be the urges that we deny, the desires we think are shameful, our rage that we hide, our cruelty that we don't show. Everything that's still in us, but not at the surface. And Jung argues that these shadow attributes of ourself, they can't be expelled. You can't shove them under a rug. You can't kick them outside because they're part of you. They will always stay with you. And if they are unresolved, they will eventually come out in a variety of fashions. So Jung argues, based on this knowledge, that they need to be integrated. Our shadow self needs to be integrated. And the first step in that is darkening. And that's where we face our shadow self. We bring it to light. Instead of suppressing it, we raise it to consciousness. We think about our worst desires, we think about our evil instincts, and we face them. The goal in alchemy ultimately is to integrate this shadow self into the better version of ourself, so that we're not necessarily perfect, but we're whole. Because otherwise we're split in two. We have competing desires that don't help us out, and when that happens, we suffer from dissonance that eventually ends in us breaking. And so Halloween, what this does to Jung's ideas is that it offers a symbolic way to confront our shadow self without enacting those attributes or enacting that version of ourself. And so that would be the side of moral evil that I'll proceed into further. But before we do that, let's jump back and think about the side of natural evil. Putting things in an existential frame, we face natural evil, which is the reality of death, decay, disease, loss, suffering not caused by humans. Because when tragedy strikes, we'll get the wake-up call of hitting a wall, that my whole life is broken because I built my whole life based on the theory that I was in control. But what's useful about Halloween is that it doesn't build your life that way. If we have these times when we approach the potential feeling of, oh, what happens if my best friend dies, or if I die tomorrow? If we live life in that manner, if something were to happen, I'm mentally more prepared for that, because I've been dealing with it in an idea of a fire alarm. Because I don't go to school every day thinking that the building is perfect and that nothing will ever happen to it. I go to school every day trusting in the human capacity of what we've been able to create as a safe place, but also acknowledging in my mind that at any time something could happen. And so that is ultimately what Halloween can offer, is because in both senses, it raises human interaction with the natural and moral evil. This matters because society does not do this. Things like natural evil and moral evil are taboo, but Halloween brings them in a playful manner. It brings death to the front door, literally and playfully. And this isn't to celebrate it, but it's to be aware of it and to learn how to deal with it in a helpful, rational way. And this is the term that I've been getting at of what Halloween does. It provides an emotional rehearsal for the inevitable, that moral evil is the temptation that we face that's real and that we have to confront every day, and natural evil, whether by natural disaster or death, every human will come in contact with. We can acknowledge them rather than eliminating death or sin, we can integrate them into our mind. Jung would say this was individuation. Becoming whole, not by becoming pure, but by seeing what we are capable of, that being moral evil, and what we cannot escape, that being natural evil. Halloween becomes not just catharsis, but very wise in that sense, because it's a symbolic coping ritual for the human condition. And that is what ultimately I've come to appreciate about Halloween this last year, because my trick-or-treating days are over. And instead of spending the rest of my life watching scary movies, I thought, what could be the potential benefit of this holiday? And I found the potential benefit to be that confrontation with the darker realities of humanity. Because life is good. Life has Christmas, it has summer, it has Easter, but life also has evil and it has death. And I think it is necessary and important to have that as a holiday, which Halloween is. And I think that's very cool. I raise the importance of Halloween because it brings to light everything that humanity and society tries to shove under the rug, and that is the natural and moral evil. But my theory is that the mask that shields that natural and moral evil is maladaptive in how we relate to fear and darkness. And that is happening in two ways. We often hide fear and darkness behind a facade, or conversely, hide behind a mask to safely indulge with it.